Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby. Today we're going to be doing a very exciting video because it's going to be my most disappointing books that I read in the year of 2023. At the end of the year, I love to do a video kind of series where I do my end of the year videos where I do my most surprising, my most disappointing, my best, and my worst of the year. So these are going to be my most disappointing, which means they're not the worst books that I read this year, but these were the books that I had some pretty high expectations or I just thought that I would really love them that I ended up feeling very disappointed by. Most of the books on this list are books that I gave somewhere between 2 or 3 stars, but I went into all of these books expecting them to become new favorites, or I just really had high hopes for them for whatever reason. The first one that's going to be kicking off this list has got to be My Darling Girl by Jennifer McMahon, which it absolutely destroys my soul, the fact that Jennifer McMahon is even on this list, because I consider her to be one of my favorite horror authors. But this book was a 2-star book for me. It's probably my least favorite Jennifer McMahon that I've read so far, which is such a huge bummer. And this book, you know, it's probably really like a me thing why this book ended up on this list, because I don't think this is a bad book. You know, it's not a badly written book. I think Jennifer McMahon, like, she does have a really great writing style. She still has really great characters. Like, the story's really interesting. But for me, it was really disappointing because this horror book involves a trope that I just find to be so cliche and so cringy. And I can't tell you about the trope because I think it's a little bit of a spoiler because it doesn't mention anything about it in the synopsis of this book. But for me personally, like, anytime this particular thing gets like included in a horror book, I just immediately like find it to be so cringy and I can't get invested in the story. And so it was really more of a me thing. Like, if I had known that this book had that trope in it, then I probably wouldn't have even picked it up to begin with. But because it's Jennifer McMahon, I'm like, yes, I'm gonna read everything that she comes out with because I really do genuinely love her writing. But this book in particular just did not work for me. I just thought it was so cringy and just so kind of like dumb, and especially like the ending, I don't know, I couldn't get into this one. And this one also does have the trope of, you know, the fact that we follow a daughter who doesn't really have the best relationship with her mother, but her mother finds out that she's terminally ill, and so she's going to be moving back in with her grown daughter who they don't get along very well, but because it might be the end of her mother's life, they decide to, you know, figure shit out and have her move in with them. And so we do get that trope of like the mother moving back in with the child so that she can take care of her because she's sick, which also is a trope that it really is hit or miss for me. And in this book, I think it was fine, but because this book already had that trope in it as well as another horror trope that I don't usually like, I think it was just like a bad mix of things for me. So this book was just disappointing for me. I think there's probably a lot of people who are really gonna like this one, but for me, I didn't love it the way that I wanted to, and I'm sad about it. Another one that I didn't end up enjoying as much as I thought I would is The Handyman Method by Nick Cutter and Andrew F. Sullivan. Oh, this one, it just sounded like it had such a cool premise. Nick Cutter is one of my favorite authors because he's the author of The Troop, which is like one of my favorite horror books of all time. And so this book, I just thought it sounded like it was going to be something I would really like. And in this story, we're following this family who like moves into a new construction home, and then some like freaky shit starts happening. I'm always here for a good haunted house horror story. Like, that's one of my favorite horror tropes. Like, I love the haunted house trope. This book was kind of a pain in the ass to read, not only because these characters were so annoying, like especially reading from the protagonist, like the dad in this book, like he's just awful and he's a piece of shit father to his son. Like, he's just one of those like very toxic men who like think they know best. And so he was just very frustrating to read from his point of view as a character. I feel like this is a story where not a lot happens. Like, there's nothing really happening in the story. And I think it actually makes sense when you think about it, because when you read the author's note at the end of this book, they kind of talk about how they had this idea to write this like novella, and it was supposed to be really short. I think it was either like the publishers requested that they like beefen up the story or like make it a little bit longer. So after knowing that, I'm like, you can really tell that they were just trying to add in all these random ass scenes just to beefen up the length of the story. Nothing interesting even happens in this book until near the very end, where there was a twist that was kind of unexpected. Like, I didn't see it coming, so that was like the only redeeming thing about this book for me. Like, this book probably would have made it on my worst of the year if it wasn't for the fact that it had kind of a cool ending. But at the same time, I don't think the ending made it very redeemable in any way, because it was still such a pain in the ass experience to like read the entirety of this book. And so I was just bummed because I thought this one had a lot of potential. I thought it could be really cool, and I really wanted to see Nick Cutter's take on like a fun haunted house kind of thing, but this just was not that. It wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't what I was looking for. And speaking of haunted houses, we have another book on this list that is A Haunting on the Hill. And this is one that I could not have been more excited about because this is the first novel that returns to the world of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. And so it's really cool because this book actually takes place at the same Hill House. But unfortunately, the this book was just so boring and it wasn't for me. I think the reason I'm most disappointed that this one didn't end up working out is not only because, you know, I love the haunted house trope, but I'm also like a pretty big fan of The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, the TV show is like one of my top favorite TV shows of all time, but then also like the book, The Haunting of Hill House, it's one of the only classics that I've really enjoyed. And so I was really disappointed because I thought this had so much potential to be great and it just completely flopped for me. Like, it was so boring. There were so many characters, like there were so many freaking characters we had to follow in this book. It got very confusing. I never found any of the scenes that took place in Hill House to be actually creepy. Like, I just thought it was all so boring and so over the top. And I was especially disappointed that I didn't end up liking this because the audiobook for this book is so cool. Like, the audiobook is one of those like full cast audiobooks. You can tell they put so much effort into making this audiobook sound incredible because they have a lot of like sound effects and just like really cool things happening on this audiobook that made the listening experience like a 10 out of 10. Like, the listening experience was so cool. They had this part where this like woman would like sing down the hallways and it was like really creepy and it sounded like you were in Hill House. You know, like the audio experience was incredible. But unfortunately, like the story was just so boring and not interesting to me that even that couldn't save this one for me. One book that was a part of my own book club, the book troop, that I was super disappointed by this year has got to be Good Bad Girl by Alice Feeney. This one was disappointing to me for a number of reasons, but the main one is the fact that I love Alice Feeney. I love her books. Rock, Paper, Scissors and Daisy Darker are two of my like favorite thrillers of all time. So with this book coming out, I could not be more excited to get my hands on the new Alice Feeney. You know, like, she's a top favorite author for me now. And this book was just so it was so not what I was expecting it to be. One thing that I thought was frustrating about this book is the fact that we're following from the perspective of 4 different characters, which I just think is a little bit too much, especially for a story like this. I don't think we needed to be following from the perspective of that many characters because it made the story a little bit confusing. It was a little convoluted, but I also just feel like because the story was told from the perspective of so many characters, it made it hard to connect with any of them. I usually am the kind of person who really loves thrillers that are kind of based around like mother-daughter relationships, you know, like I find that to be very interesting, and so this book definitely had those elements going for it. But also like the writing in this book, just in general, like the writing drove me absolutely nuts because since the book is called Good Bad Girl, the author would try to do this thing almost like at the end of every chapter where it would be like, well, you know, sometimes bad people will do a good thing, or like sometimes good people will have to do a bad thing, and like sometimes good people aren't so good all of the time, and just those little like insights that this author would try to put at the end of every chapter to like make this book feel deeper than it was or something. It drove me nuts. There was some elements towards the end of this book that I enjoyed, and like there was even one twist, if you can even call it a twist, that I thought was a little bit surprising. Like I didn't see that coming personally, but also like there was something about the twists in this book that I can't mention because I don't want to get into spoilers, but there's just something about the twists in this book that didn't really do it for me. I just wanted more out of the story. I feel like the thrilling elements in this book were really lacking. It felt a lot more just like a family drama between a lot of these characters instead of an actual thriller. You know, I did see a lot of people discussing the difference between a thriller and a mystery, and I do think this book leans more towards a mystery. Like I would say this is a mystery, this is not a thriller, because there's nothing thrilling really happening in this book, and I think that's why it ended up being so disappointing for me. And then just to compare this book to, you know, Alice Feeney's previous books, I feel like this book lacked an atmosphere, and that also made the reading experience like not as fun for me because, you know, in Rock, Paper, Scissors, it had that really great snowy atmosphere, and then in Daisy Darker, it was the really great like island stormy vibes. It took place on Halloween. Like, it was just so much fun in those books, but this book had no atmosphere. And then another book that was from my own book club this year was Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier. This one was also such a bummer that I didn't end up enjoying this because Jennifer Hillier is an author that is very hit or miss for me, but the ones that I've loved from her, I really love. Like Jar of Hearts and The Butcher were both 5 stars for me. Like I really love those, but it seems like anytime that I pick her for my book club, I just end up really not liking them for whatever reason. I swear my book club is cursed, I know that. But this one sounded like it could be so cool, and this one had so much potential, and I think that's why it ended up being such a disappointing read for me, because look at this cover, it's so cool. This book takes place at an amusement park. There's like a clown museum. This one was really cool because we're following a female detective, and it takes place in Washington, which like I live in the Pacific Northwest in Washington, so like it's really cool for me to to read thriller or horror books that take place in this area. And then they also find a body in the amusement park and they're trying to explain like what happened. They're trying to figure out what the heck happened. And so this book just had all of the potential to be great. Like it just sounded like it was going to be such a fun time and it just wasn't at all. I think this book suffers from the fact that it's very long. I think this book is a lot longer than it needed to be. I don't think it needed to be more than 400 pages. I also think this book suffers from too many perspectives from what I remember, because you're not only reading from the point of view of this detective, but you're reading from like a bunch of different people. I also I just don't love reading from the perspective of a detective. Just in general with books, like I find the detective point of view can be so boring and so repetitive. I just expected so much more, especially from the clown museum. Like, do you know the potential this could have had with the clown museum? Another one of the thrillers that I read this year that disappointed me the most has got to be Gone Tonight by Sarah Pekkanen. And I think this one was so disappointing for me because I was really hooked in the first half of this book. I was really loving the writing, and like I just said, I love thrillers that are about mother-daughter relationships. Like that's something that really intrigues me with books. And so this definitely had that because our protagonist, we're following this character who's going to be taking care of her mother. I was also really into the audiobook for this one because the audiobook is narrated by the queen, Kate Mara herself, which was also just really cool. But I feel like unfortunately, once this book hits part 2, which is about like maybe 100 pages into this, I thought it got so ridiculous and just so slow, and I just wasn't a fan of this book anymore. Something that I thought was interesting about this book is that we're jumping back and forth between the daughter's perspective and then her mom's perspective. But I was not very happy with some of the things happening in this book, at least in terms of like her mother and her health. Like I was not happy about how that situation was handled at all. It was actually just very frustrating for me to read this. And then towards the end of this book, oh my god, it just got so cringy and over the top, and I just didn't give a fuck about anything that was happening. I think this book reminded me a lot of Pieces of Her by Karen Slaughter. It definitely felt very similar to that in terms of like the mother-daughter relationship and like learning a lot about the mother's past and like different things like that. Pieces of Her was another book that I gave that book 1 star. Like I really did not like that book. So I mean, maybe if you enjoyed Pieces of Her by Karen Slaughter, maybe this one would be for you, but it was just not for me. I just thought it was so disappointing. Another horror book that I have on this list is the book What Kind of Mother? And this is one that has to be on this list because the beginning of this book gripped me. I literally thought that this book could be a new favorite from like those first like 50 to 100 pages. I was in it. And this book is really interesting because we're following this woman who's living in this very small town. She's a palm reader, and like that's kind of what she does for her job, is she like reads people's palms and like talks about their futures and stuff. And the audiobook for this one is really great because the narrator has such a thick southern accent, but she just does it so well that you feel like you're in the South with her. And there's this really great like mystery setup because there was this guy that she like used to know when she was in high school, and he's had some recent traumatic experiences where like his wife died or like something happened with him, and so she goes to like read his palm to try to figure out like what's going on with him. It just had such an interesting setup. It was so eerie and just so creepy, and I really liked the vibes of this at the beginning. But then, oh my gosh, dude, the plot twist in this book, I think it's like the plot twist that you read once you hit like part 2, or like you find out something around like part 2 of the book and you're like, wait, what? And like everything completely changes in the book, and I was not a fan of the plot twist in this book. Like it was so dumb in my opinion. Like it was so dumb, and it just completely ruined everything that I loved about this book. And I was so frustrated. Like I could not be more frustrated that was the plot twist. Like that's what we're going with. It's not like the plot twist was like problematic or like anything like that. It was just so random and like why? So this was a huge disappointment for me. I just feel like this book could have had so much potential to be a new favorite for me if the author had went in any other direction than that. And then another horror book that I was severely disappointed by this year was Everything the Darkness Eats by Eric LaRocca, which it breaks my heart, to have Eric LaRocca on this list because, once again, Eric LaRocca is one of my favorite horror authors. He's written so many 5-star horror books for me, and he's also just like a generally really cool human being. Like he's so nice every time I interact with him. Like he's amazing. But this book in particular just really didn't work for me. I think mainly because this book was really confusing. I think there's at least 2 timelines that you're following in this book, but there could be more. I can't remember if there's a 3rd one. But you're going back and forth between these timelines, and I thought it was so confusing. There was only one timeline that I was really invested in, and that was like the gay couples timeline. And it all takes place in this really small town that is very homophobic. So I think this book was a little bit hard to read at times too, because from what I remember, there's like extreme homophobia in this book to the point where it's just a little stomach stomach turning. Like, it was not a fun reading experience. But then also there is a lot of like sexual violence in this book that was really hard to stomach, and that was like the main reason why I found this book to be so hard to get through. But there was also some elements of this book, like I was so confused. Like, I was so confused reading this. It was kind of hard to follow. Like, I had no fucking idea what was going on half the time. There was also a lot of like religious undertones in this book because it takes place in this really small town, and the way that this book would have these religious undertones with this also equally strong like homophobic kind of mindset, it was hard to read. And I don't usually like reading a lot of religion in my books. I didn't really know that this one was going to be so heavy-handed with the religious themes. It just really wasn't for me. Like, it wasn't necessarily a bad book. I was just mostly confused and disappointed, and I felt like it wasn't for me. Another book that I read that I was so sad I didn't end up liking this one is Never Let Me Go. This is one that I know is a bit of a hot take because I know a lot of people really freaking love this book. I read this book this year because I was doing a video where I read books that were kind of like Black Mirror, and this is one that I've had on my TBR for literally years because everybody's always compared this book to Black Mirror, and every time I heard the premise I was like, oh my gosh, this could be something I would really enjoy. Like, it sounds cool. But this book did not work for me for a number of reasons. I just really struggled with this one. I could not get invested in the story. I found the writing style to be so bleak and just kind of like boring. Like, I felt like nothing was happening in this book. This one is definitely more of a character study instead of like a sci-fi, because I think when I went into this book I was thinking, oh my god, it's gonna be like intense, like Black Mirror, like, you know, sci-fi kind of vibes, but it's not that vibe at all. It's actually just more of a character study. It's a slow burn. The thing with this one that I really struggled with was even to connect to any of the characters. Like, I just didn't care about any of them as characters, and I feel like this is a book that would really require you to care about the characters in order to like care about the story and like what's happening in the plot. At least in my opinion, like, I just couldn't get into it. I also do think there were some elements of this book that I found to be a little bit confusing, and most of the time I just found myself like scratching my head and being like, what the heck is going on? It just made me sad because I know a lot of people really love this book, and I really wish that I saw what you saw in it, but it just really wasn't for me at the end of the day. I think this book has such a cool premise and such a cool idea. Like, once you get to the twist and you realize like what's actually going on in this book, I think that's really interesting, but I think it was the execution specifically in this book that just did not work for me personally. And then the last book on this list of most disappointing reads of the year has got to be Secluded Cabin, Sleeps 6. And this is a book that I read very early in the year. I think I read this in like January or February, and I'm still devastated by how disappointed I was in this book, because this is like one of my dream premise kind of synopsis kind of books, you know, like this is exactly what I look for in thrillers, because the premise lets you know that there's gonna be like this snowstorm happening, there's gonna be these like 3 couples I think who are staying in this secluded little cabin, and then it's kind of like a locked room mystery thriller because shit starts going down, there's like stormy vibes, they think maybe like is there somebody watching them, like there's just creepy stalker vibes. It basically just had my dream premise. Like, this should have been everything that I wanted and more, but this book was just so not great, and I think it mainly had to do with the fact that this is another one of those thrillers that suffers from way too many points of views, because I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, you follow like 6 different perspectives, because I think you follow like a few people who are in the relationships, but then you also get like random point of views, and like one of them is like in the past of like when they were either kids or like teenagers, I can't remember, but I was like, what the heck is going on? Like, why do we have so many point of views? Like, this is so unnecessary, and it makes the book so much more confusing. Usually when I read a thriller, like, I don't want it to be bogged down by a bunch of unnecessary point of views that just make the reading experience so much more confusing than it needs to be. I just feel like this one had so much potential because of the cool, like, snowy atmosphere, and I really liked, there was one perspective in particular that I really liked where it felt like, they felt like somebody was, like, watching them, or you got the point of view of, like, some anonymous person that was, like, creeping on them, and I really liked that perspective, but then I never ended up feeling shocked or, like, anything about the ending. I just thought it was so mid. Like, everything in this thriller was something that I've read before. It just didn't really bring anything new to the table, and it was just a lot of wasted potential, and I think that's, at the end of the day, what made me so upset about this one, because it had so much potential. Yeah, those were all of my most disappointing books of the year. I don't even want to talk about the fact that almost every single book on this list was a thriller or a horror book. I mean, I know I had one sci-fi-ish kind of book with Never Let Me Go, but the fact that the rest of these were all thriller or horror books, like, that is so upsetting. I feel like especially the thriller genre in the year of 2023, it was a bit of a bust. Like, the thrillers, especially in 2023, were not very great in my opinion. Like, there were very few thrillers that I absolutely loved this year. And I know like a lot of friends have been talking about the fact that, oh, well, maybe it's because, you know, a lot of the thrillers that are publishing right now were books that authors were writing like during the pandemic or like while people were going through hard times. And like, I totally get that, but it still sucks that there were so many thrillers that came out this year that I just thought absolutely sucked. Like, what is going on? So hopefully the year of 2024 is a much better year for thrillers because I'm addicted to thrillers. I can't stop reading them. It's just one of my favorite genres to read. Like, I'm always going to gravitate towards the new thrillers. I'm always going to be picking them up because I'm just addicted to them. I can't stop. So hopefully 2024 is a better year for the thrillers. But I would love to know if you've read any of the books on this list. Please let me know, what do you think of them? I would also love to know, what are your most disappointing books that you read this year? I'm very curious. I would love to know if you can let me know in the comments. And once again, I'm going to be doing videos very soon for my most surprising, my best, and my worst of the year, so you can be looking forward to those very soon. I will have links in the description for all of the previous times that I've done videos like this if you want to check those out. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!